The Montana Territory, January 1888. A sky the color of a bruise spreading west to east across the Beartooth foothills, not storm yet, but the promise of something that does not negotiate. The valley below sits in false warmth, mud where ice stood a week ago, cattle bunching in the south pasture, with their heads down in the posture of animals receiving information that humans around them have not yet processed. A hillside, red clay. A thin line of smoke rising from the earth itself, not from a chimney, not from a structure visible above the grade, just smoke rising from the ground as though the hill is breathing. Inside that hill, a woman sits, still, reading. Outside, the temperature begins to drop. 1 degree, then 7. Then the western horizon delivers what it has been holding back, a wall of white moving at the speed of consequence, and every wooden structure in the valley suddenly revealed for what it is. A gamble. She had known. The wind arrived without announcement. On January 12, 1888, at 3 in the afternoon, it descended on the Harwick Valley the way catastrophe always descends on the Montana Territory, not gradually, not with the courtesy of warning, but as a wall of atmosphere that had been holding its weight back for days before deciding that patience was finished. Inside the dugout carved into the south face of Ridgeback Hill, 4 kilometers from what remained of the town, Vera Callum sat in the chair she had built from cottonwood scraps. The cast iron stove breathed at a low, steady rhythm, the air held at 13 degrees Celsius. Outside, the temperature was dropping through -20 and still falling. The differential between those two numbers was the entire story of the past 9 months, compressed into the evidence of a thermometer mounted just inside the door. She had known this was coming, not through instinct or the old Tammer's calculus of aching joints and grandmother rhyme. She had known it the way she knew everything that mattered, by reading the evidence without flinching from what it said. She had known it since April, since the morning she drove the spade into the red clay of that hillside and felt the earth return a temperature that had nothing to do with the season above. The blizzard was not the story. The blizzard was the proof. She turned a page. 9 months earlier, on the 14th of April, 1887, Vera Callum rode into Harwick, Montana Territory on a gray mare named Rue, carrying a surveyor's compass that had belonged to her husband, a leather satchel of technical drawings refined over 2 years of solitary preparation, $190 folded inside her left boot, a working knowledge of dense clay soil that most credentialed engineers in the territory did not possess. Specific grief of a woman 3 years widowed who had converted that grief into something she could use. She was 42 years old. Her hair had gone the color of creek water in November, brown where light caught it, gray where it did not. Her hands bore the calluses of draptophan work, the outer edge of the right palm stained with graphite that no amount of washing fully removed. She wore a coat altered twice from one that had been Edmund's. She did not look like a homesteader. This was Harwick's first day of mistakes, long series of mistakes he would make regarding her. Edmund Callum had died in January of 1884 in the Dakota Territory during a survey expedition along the Cannonball River when ice gave way beneath the weight of an equipment sled. The Army Corps of Engineers sent a condolence letter, a final paycheck, nothing else. 11 years of his labor, 11 years of mapping terrain that would be parceled into homestead claims and sold to settlers whose survival depended on understanding the land he had mapped, reduced to a form letter. Vera kept the letter. She did not keep the sentiment. What she kept was the knowledge. For 11 years, she had worked alongside Edmund as his draftsman. Not in any capacity the Corps acknowledged officially, but in every practical sense that determined whether the work was accurate. She drew the topographic maps. She read soil profiles. She sat through the long Dakota winters in whatever temporary shelter they had built that season, measuring what the earth did when you asked it properly. She learned that ground 2 feet below the surface held approximately 12 degrees Celsius regardless of what the sky above it was doing. She learned that dense clay absorbed heat at a rate higher than loam and released it more slowly. The same property that made it poor for farming made it ideal for what she was planning. She learned that a south-facing slope at this latitude caught winter sun at precisely the angle needed to warm a front wall without overheating the interior. These were not intuitions. They were measurements repeated across multiple winters recorded in the survey journal she carried in the leather satchel. After Edmonton, she spent 2 years in Billings doing clerical work for a land surveying office, which was the closest approximation of her actual skills that a woman could be paid. She saved carefully. She read everything available on construction methodology, on thermal behavior of soil, on insulation physics. A government pamphlet on dugout construction told her more through its errors than through its guidance. She wrote corrections in the margins, then wrote her own version from scratch on the backs of old survey forms. By spring of 1887, she had a plan specific enough to execute, money enough to fund it if nothing went wrong. In the first 3 months, a horse, a compass, a complete technical drawing of every structural element she intended to build. She had also identified Harwick, Montana Territory as the location, specifically the clay-heavy east face slope of Ridgeback Hill, whose soil density she had estimated from territorial survey data and whose south exposure she had confirmed from topographic maps. She arrived knowing what she was going to build before she saw the hill. The land office smelled of pine resin and old coffee. The county registrar, a careful man named Aldous Pryor, looked up when she entered, down at his ledger, up again. Her application was for 160 acres on the Ridgeback Hill claim, remote, unwanted, close enough to the creek drainage to make water manageable. The application was in order. Pryor began to stamp it. Crosswell was in the office by the particular kind of coincidence. Man up a position in some other reason I share through habit and presence. He was there to formalize a grazing extension on pasture acreage he had been using without proper title, a routine matter in Harwick, because Dunmore's routines tended to become Harwick's routines through a process no one had formally agreed to. He was 51, broad across the shoulders, with a rancher's face that had learned to hold its expressions in reserve, because expressions cost something. He was not a cruel man. He was something more durable, a man who had concluded, sometime in his 40s, that his judgment was simply more accurate than most other people's judgment, and who had been rewarded for this belief often enough that the belief had calcified into certainty. He looked at Vera's application. He looked at Vera. He said, with genuine courtesy, the most condescending thing a man can offer a woman who knows more than he does. Ma'am, I don't doubt your intention. I question your preparation. Vera did not respond immediately. She had learned, across 11 years of being the only woman in rooms full of men who were certain about things she had already measured, that the first response set the shape of everything that followed. She looked at Pryor. Is the application in order? Pryor confirmed it. She said she would be at the land by Monday. She rolled her drawings, secured them in the satchel, pulled on her gloves. Dunmore followed her outside. He was not threatening, he was explanatory, which is a different mode of the same authority. He said Ridgeback Hill's clay-heavy soil was unsuitable for crops. He said winter winds off the Beartooth foothills had taken roofs from 2 established barns in 4 years. He said a woman alone. And here he paused in the way of someone offering a word as a kindness rather than a diminishment, would not have the labor capacity to build a structure capable of surviving a Montana winter before the season arrived. He said all of this looking directly at her, which he probably considered respectful. She let him finish. Then, how deep does your frost line run in January? He blinked. She did not wait for the answer she already knew. I ask because it determines the minimum foundation depth for a structure built to last, and everything you've described assumes I'm planning to build what everyone else builds. She untied Rue from the post. I'm not. She rode toward Ridgeback Hill. By the end of that week, Harwick had settled on its opinion. The name emerged the way names in small towns always emerge, from the accumulated wit of several people, refined through repetition until it achieved the weight of fact. Callum's Folly. Thomas Breck, who built most of the structures in and around Harwick, and who held what he considered the regional authority on construction, established a betting pool at the saloon by the second week of May. The terms, how long before the roof collapsed? The consensus favored the first significant snowfall. Breck himself took the spring runoff position, a professional judgment delivered with the quiet confidence of a man who has watched bad ideas fail in predictable ways. Vera began construction the first week of May. She had identified the south-facing slope of Ridgeback Hill 3 weeks earlier after systematic soil testing, probing depth at 15-meter intervals, reading clay density by texture and color, mapping the drainage gradient of the hillside after a rain. The clay-heavy soil Dunmore had cited as a liability was, in her calculation, the primary asset. Dense clay at this depth held 12 degrees Celsius through January. Dense clay also required proper technique. It did not forgive errors in sod placement, which she would learn in August. The footprint was 9 meters wide by 7.5 deep, excavated into the hillside at a depth that placed the floor 1.5 meters below the original grade. Cottonwood uprights from a lumber yard 40 kilometers north reinforced the walls. The floor was packed, clay hammered, until it did not yield under a boot heel. She worked with Rue on the sled harness to move larger sections, cut prairie sod into rectangular bricks, averaging 45 centimeters long and 10 deep, heavy as wet concrete. The roof was where the engineering lived. Heavy timber beams forming the primary structure, willow branches laid between them, dried prairie hay packed above for insulation. Sod bricks placed grass side down so the root system remained active and would knit successive courses into a living membrane. The entire assembly 42 centimeters thick. Standard frontier dugout construction placed sod grass side up, which dried, contracted, developed gaps. She had read the government pamphlet on this. She had also read what happened to structures built that way in their second winter. The south-facing front wall carried a single glass pane, $11, the most expensive individual component, angled to admit low winter sun between 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. A roof overhang above it blocked the high summer sun entirely. This required no mechanical assistance. It required geometry. June arrived with heat that pressed down on the plains like a flat iron. On the 14th, moving sod brick up the slope with Rue in the sled harness, the rope assembly caught a buried root. The mare lurched to compensate. The torque went somewhere it was not designed to go. The snap preceded Vera's understanding of what had happened by perhaps 2 seconds. Rue's right foreleg had fractured above the fetlock. The mare stood on 3 legs with the stillness of an animal in shock, breathing shallow, the white of her eye visible at the edge. Vera stood beside her. This was not a moment with a useful length, not long enough for rest, not short enough to be purely practical. She ran her hand down Rue's neck once. Then she looked at the sled, at the sod bricks still needing to reach the building site, at the distance and grade of the slope between them. She set the leg with splints made from straight scrap timber, wrapped it with canvas strips, fashioned a sling and post system in the stable space that would keep the fracture unweighted while it began to knit. Then she looked at the sled again. She fashioned a pulling harness from the same rope that had failed the configuration. She attached it across her chest. She moved the sled uphill by the mechanism of putting one foot in front of the other. Each brick weighed between 12 and 15 kilograms. A full sled load was 20 bricks. The distance from the cutting site to the building seat was 180 meters, most of it uphill. 6 trips on a good day, 4 on a difficult one. Several people from Harwick came out that first week to observe, not maliciously, in the way people come to witness something that confirms what they already believe. Breck came on a Wednesday, stood at the bottom of the slope, watched, said nothing. By Friday, the image had completed 2 circuits of the general store, each iteration adding detail that made the conclusion more certain. What the story did not include was the quality of the silence at 6 in the morning when the light was new and the only sounds were Vera's breathing and the scrape of sled runners on red clay. The work had a correctness to it that had nothing to do with ease. Each trip was one fewer than remained. This was not inspiration. It was arithmetic, which had been her native language for a long time. Rue's fracture began to knit by mid-July. Light work only, and carefully. Vera returned to sled operations with the mare in a modified harness that kept the repaired leg from bearing lateral load, which required adjusting the sled's weight distribution across each load. She lost 2 weeks of full-pace work. She did not lose the structure. August brought the crisis she had not fully planned for, which is the nature of crises. They arrive in the gap between what was planned and what materials, weather, and human error actually produce. The northeast corner of the roof, covering approximately 2 square meters, had been placed under the pressure of July heat, moving faster than she could work. 6 bricks in that section had gone down grass side up. She did not know this until a moderate overnight rain in early August showed her. A section of the corner dropped inward, bringing wet clay with it in a sound she felt in her sternum before she heard it with her ears. She stood in the doorway looking at the mess. Not at the failure as failure, but at its dimensions. 2 square meters. The surrounding sections held. The structural beams beneath were undamaged. 2 square meters of sod placed incorrectly in a hurry, failing as incorrectly placed sod fails, predictably in the rain in August, exactly as the physics required. She rebuilt it. She removed the failed section entirely, inspected every brick in the adjacent areas, corrected 2 additional incorrectly oriented bricks she found on the east edge, rebuilt the corner with the attention she had not given it the first time. 6 days, working in rain on the 4th day because the rain did not care about her schedule. When the repair was complete, she pressed her palm flat against the new sod and pushed. The roof returned exactly the pressure she put in. There was no triumph in this. The roof was supposed to hold. She had built it to hold. The repair was the correction of her own error, not the achievement of something new. She noted the dimensions of the failure and the cause in the survey journal, added a note about sod orientation verification that she should have written in May, closed the journal. Then she went to check en route. By the first week of September, the dugout was complete. Connecting tunnel to the stable sealed. Stone hearth set at the rear wall, its mass calculated to absorb daytime heat and radiate through the night at a rate that would reduce stove dependency by approximately 60% compared to a freestanding structure of equivalent size. Total cost, $162, inclusive of the glass pane, the second-hand stove purchased from a widow in Billings who was relocating east, nails, rope, lumber, the incidentals of 2 supply trips. The land had cost $50. She had entered Harwick with $190. She was $12 short of breaking even, which meant she had enough remaining for coffee, salt, the satisfaction of having been precisely wrong about one number in a calculation that was otherwise accurate. The last days of summer tested the structure before winter made the real argument. A heat wave settled over the Beartooth foothills in mid-September, pushing afternoon temperatures to 37 degrees Celsius in Harwick. Vera measured the interior at 11 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, 6 in the evening. The readings were 18, 17, 17. A variation of 1 degree across 9 hours of peak heat. In Harwick, people slept on their porches. She did not report these numbers to anyone. She wrote them in the survey journal and went back to cutting firewood. October brought the first frosts, the thermal pattern inverted. When overnight temperatures dropped to -8, the earth walls, which had absorbed heat through the long summer, began releasing it. The dense clay remembered what had been stored in it. She lit the stove 2 hours in the evening. By morning, the interior was 11 degrees Celsius. In the 2-story clapboard houses of Harwick, people fed their stoves through the night and woke to cold floors. Dunmore made his position clear at the general store in late October, holding court in the way of a man whose position in the room was as established as the furniture. The earth stays warm in October. I've got a root cellar, does the same. Come January, we'll see what that hole holds against a real Montana winter. Several people nodded. The betting pool at Breck's Saloon recalibrated its timeline. January was now the consensus terminus. November passed in the productive routine of a person who has completed the large-scale thinking and is executing the detail. Firewood, more than she needed, which was deliberate, because surplus firewood was both practical insurance and a private record of how much she would not burn compared to her neighbors. Every seal in the dugout inspected. The chimney draw tested under cold conditions. An additional course of hay bales laid against the north interior wall, where she had observed minor moisture variation, suggesting drainage that needed addressing before it became structural. She worked without urgency. Urgency was what people felt when they had not prepared in time. She also washed the linen, which was the practice she had carried from the Dakota Territory years, not as mystical attunement, but as systematic data collection. She tracked Dunmore's cattle behavior in the south pasture, visible from the upper edge of Ridgeback Hill. She noted migration timing of birds along the creek drainage. She tracked barometric behavior across the autumn storm sequence off the Beartooth foothills, correlating cloud formations with temperature changes, recording which configurations preceded which weather events. By December, she had enough observations to model severe weather events in this valley with reasonable confidence. On the morning of January 10th, the weather was wrong in the precise way she had learned to fear most, deceptively mild. A Chinook had been moving down from the mountains for 3 days, melting what little snow cover existed, turning frozen ground to mud. Harwick was pleased. It felt like early reprieve. Vera stood outside the dugout in the early morning and looked at the western horizon. The color there was not quite right, a greenish quality at the margin, barely perceptible unless you had been reading skies over flat country for years. Dunmore's cattle were bunching in the south pasture, not grazing, not moving toward water. Standing close together in the field's center, with heads lowered, which was the posture of animals receiving information from the air that the air had not yet delivered to the humans watching them. She went inside. She opened the survey journal and wrote the date, the horizon color, the cattle behavior, the barometric reading from the instrument Edmund's brother had given her, low and falling. Then she wrote two numbers. Below them, 36 to 48 hours. January 10th was preparation. Extra water from the creek into the large interior barrel. Firewood moved inside the stable tunnel where it would stay dry through whatever came. 4 bales of hay from the exterior stack into Rue's section, door hinges oiled, window frame checked for seal. Every gap she could locate chinked. She worked methodically, without the emotion of urgency, because the time for urgency had been April, when she could still have made different decisions. Everything available now was execution of what April had already decided. On the morning of January 11th, she rode into Harwick. She tied Rue at the schoolhouse post. Margaret Aldridge was 26 years old, a teacher from Ohio carrying the particular idealism of someone who had read extensively about the frontier without yet having lived through a Montana January. She was not foolish. She was inexperienced, which is a different condition and a more correctable one. When Vera told her to close the school the following day and send children home before noon, Aldridge's face moved through attention, concern, the beginning of agreement. Then the door opened. Sheriff Harlan Osgood had seen Vera tie up at the schoolhouse. He was not a dishonest man. He was a mediocre one, comfortable with the authority his position provided, uncomfortable with information that required him to act against the consensus of people whose opinion mattered to him. He listened to what Vera said. He looked at the clear sky through the window. Then he said, in a voice designed to be remembered by everyone in the room, "I'm not closing the county school on the word of a woman who lives in a hole on a hill." He looked at Vera with something that approached apology, but stopped short of it. "The sky is clear. The children will be fine." Vera looked at Osgood for a moment that she did not extend beyond what it required. Then she looked at Aldridge. "If the sky changes tomorrow morning," she said, "send them home. Don't wait for permission." She did not stay to see whether Aldridge nodded. She went to Dunmore's ranch house next. This was the hardest stop, not because of what he might say, but because of what requesting anything from him cost her, and because the cost was real and she paid it anyway. She stood at his door. She said, "There's a severe storm arriving in the next 24 to 36 hours. I've been tracking the indicators for 3 days. I'm not asking you to believe me about the construction. I'm asking you to move your cattle to the creek shelter and check your barn roof." Dunmore looked at the open sky above her head. He looked back at her with the patience of a man addressing someone who means well, but does not have access to the relevant expertise. "Mrs. Callum," he said, "I've been ranching in this valley for 14 years. He said it gently. Gently was the most complete form of dismissal. Vera rode back up Ridgeback Hill. She put Rue in the stable, checked water, checked hay, checked the door seal a final time. She built the fire to 14 degrees Celsius. She sat in the cottonwood chair with the technical manual she had been reading for 3 weeks, which was more useful as evidence of what its author did not understand than as a source of new information. The lamp was trimmed. Outside, the Chinook had dropped to nothing. The silence that replaced it was the specific silence of a held breath, not absence of sound, but the presence of potential, the moment before the variable resolves. She read 3 pages. Then she set the book down and looked at the lamp flame, which burned without any flicker at all because the dugout was sealed well enough that there was not the slightest draft. 13 degrees on the floor, 14 at chest height. The stone hearth still returning the afternoon's fire at the slow, reliable rate that stone returns what it absorbs. She had spent 9 months engineering this specific quality of stillness into the hillside, and the hill was now returning it exactly as calculated. Outside at 4 in the afternoon, the Chinook's absence became something she could feel in the pressure of the air through the door's seam. She had seen this before, the specific quality of the pause before a front hit. In the Dakota Territory, in the winter of 1881, from a canvas shelter that lasted 11 minutes against what followed. She knew the color of the sky she would find if she opened the door. She did not need to open it. She picked the book back up. Rue shifted in the stable with a sound of hooves on packed clay. The stove breathed. Vera Callum turned the page and waited for Harwick to understand what she had known since April, and felt neither triumph nor vindication in advance of it, only the specific weight of being right about something that would cost people she did not hate everything it was going to cost. The storm announced itself not with sound but with pressure, a change in the air inside the dugout, so subtle it registered in the ears before the mind named it, the sensation of atmosphere making a decision. At 11 in the morning on January 12th, the Chinook's residue evaporated entirely. The wind died to absolute zero. The silence lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then the front that had been organizing itself over the Beartooth foothills since before dawn came down on the Harwick Valley at the speed of something falling rather than moving. And the temperature began its work. 1 degree Celsius to -9 in 40 minutes, -9 to -19 by early afternoon. By 3 o'clock, the exterior thermometer read -29. The wind was not the howling that people described in accounts written afterward. Howling implied a shape to the sound, a frequency that varied. This was a roar, uniform and continuous, the sound of atmosphere converted to instrument. Snow did not fall. It traveled horizontally at speeds that scoured exposed wood down to grain. Visibility at the valley floor zero. The Schoolhouse Blizzard had arrived, and it had arrived without the courtesy of being survivable in the open. Inside the dugout, the thermometer read 13 degrees Celsius. The differential between outside and inside was 42 degrees. The earth between those two numbers was doing what dense clay does when 9 months of preparation have asked it to do exactly this. It held. Vera fed the stove with the minimum wood required to maintain temperature, not the maximum that anxiety would have recommended. She had calculated her wood supply for a 3-day event. She did not know yet whether 3 days would be sufficient. She rationed accordingly. At 4:30 in the afternoon, the first sound came from outside the door. Not the structural percussion of wind against the hillside, not the creak of timber under load, but something organic and intermittent. A fist against the wood, irregular, without the force of a person who still had full use of their hands. She unbarred the door. Thomas Breck filled the frame with his height rather than his features, because his features had become a condition rather than a face. White, where frostbite had already claimed the outer tissue. Gray, where circulation had retreated toward the core. Eyes red at the rim and blinking against the interior light with the reflexive wonder of something that has returned from a place that does not typically permit return. His coat was a shell. He moved his jaw twice before his body released the energy required for speech. And what came out had the particular quality of a man whose system had been directing all available resources away from non-essential functions for several hours. The roof. I put money on your roof going first. A pause. His teeth were doing something involuntary. Mine went instead. Vera said nothing. She pulled him inside by the forearm, sat him near the stove at the closest safe distance, stripped the ice-crusted coat, wrapped him in the wool blanket from the chair back. She put a pan of water on the stove. She examined his hands, left worse than right, the fingertips carrying the yellowish white of deep tissue involvement. She did not warm them directly. She put them under her arms, inside the wool of her coat, against the warmth of her sides, because direct heat applied to deeply frostbitten tissue warms the surface faster than circulation can restore to the deeper layers, which produces additional destruction. She had learned this from a Corps physician in Dakota in the winter of 1882, during a survey season that produced 2 cases of significant frostbite before the team learned to stop working outside past 2 in the afternoon. She held Breck's hands there and let physics do what physics does when given adequate time. 20 minutes in, the second knock. This one carried more bodies behind it, a sound that was multiple fists, or one person with more reserve than Breck had arrived with. She opened the door to Margaret Aldridge and 4 children. The teacher's face was raw in the specific way of ice crystals driven at speed against skin, not frostbitten but abraded, the surface reddened and tight. 2 of the children showed frostbite on their ears. One boy, 11 years old, whom she would later learn was called Petey Marsh, was moving with the mechanical deliberateness of a body that has converted its last voluntary resources into the single project of continued forward motion, which is a thing the body does just before it stops. Aldridge crossed the threshold. She turned to count the children behind her. She counted 4. She turned back to Vera with the eyes of a woman who had been 26 years old that morning and was not anymore. 2 didn't make it to the fence line. Her voice had the flatness of someone who has been saying something to themselves for several hours that they have not yet said aloud. The rope between us, we had the rope, and we still couldn't. She stopped. The smallest child present, a girl of perhaps 8, was crying without sound in the way children cry when they have been crying for a long time and have run out of the energy that sound requires. Vera moved immediately. Petey marched to the stow position, his hands under her arms where Breck's had been once she released them. The crying child wrapped in Rue's stable blanket, which she retrieved through the connecting tunnel in 45 seconds. The other 3 children directed to the south interior wall where the earth temperature was most stable. Aldridge put to work at the water pan, keeping it at temperature, cycling the tin cup, because idle hands in a crisis become a separate crisis. And because the work would replace, at least partially, the loop her mind was currently running on the 2 children who had not made it to the fence. The 2 children had separated from the group somewhere in the white between the schoolhouse and the fence line. They were not dead. Vera did not know this yet. What she knew in the hours that followed was that knowing their status was not possible and that acting on the assumption they were alive was the only available position. She would learn 3 days later that one boy had found the Dunmore cattle shelter and spent the night between 2 steers whose body heat kept him from the worst. The other, a girl named Frances, had gone to ground in a shallow coulee, pulled her coat over her head, and waited with a patience that no child should need to possess. Both survived. Both paid for it in the specific currency of severe frostbite. Frances would lose the tip of the index finger on her left hand. The boy would carry a stiffness in 3 toes through every winter for the rest of his life. But they survived, which was not the outcome that the storm had been designed to produce. By 9 in the evening, the dugout held 9 people. Mayor Greer and his wife had covered the kilometer from their house to Ridgeback Hill by following the fence posts along the eastern pasture road, which added distance but provided the tactile guidance that zero visibility required. The mayor's wife had wrapped herself in the front room curtain, which was not adequate insulation, but was better than the alternative, and which demonstrated a resourcefulness Vera noted without comment. She brought them in. She recalculated the food supply against 9 people rather than 7. She did not revise her expression. Before midnight, 2 families arrived whose roofs had failed under the weight of drifting snow. The Harker family, 5 members, and Samuel Pruitt, the general store proprietor, alone. Pruitt was 64 and had lived in the territory for 30 years. He said later that he had smelled Vera's chimney smoke before he could see any sign of the hill, wood smoke cutting through ice crystal air. At the moments when the roar's frequency shifted fractionally detectable at ground level by someone moving with his face down and his attention on the air rather than the invisible middle distance, he had walked toward the smell. 16 people now, in a space designed for 1 woman and a horse. The mathematics should not have worked. The mathematics was the argument. Every additional body in the room added thermal load in a direction that helped human bodies generate heat. And heat in a well-insulated space held by dense clay had nowhere efficient to go except back into the people who needed it. Vera moved people against the walls and away from the center where air temperature was lowest. Children into the corners where earth temperature was most stable. Anyone with full hand function given a task, because task performance generated muscle heat. She managed the stove fuel with the precision of someone who understood that the difference between adequate warmth and dangerous cold in this room across this many hours was measured in board feet of wood remaining. Past 1 in the morning, the 4th knock. She was managing the second food distribution for the children. Cornmeal heated in the pan, children served first, the rule she had stated once and enforced without discussion when the knock came. She was tired in the way that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with sequential decisions made without pause for 3 hours. She opened the door. Cresswell Dunmore stood in the frame. He was holding a child with both arms, the child's weight distributed across his chest and the crook of his left elbow, in the way of someone who has been carrying that weight for longer than his arms were designed to sustain. The child was his nephew, 6 years old, named Eli, the son of Dunmore's younger sister, visiting from Billings, who was currently sheltering with two ranch hands in the equipment barn at the south end of the Dunmore property, where the lower roof pitch had held against the drifting. Eli was unconscious. His face carried the particular colorlessness of a child whose body has made the executive decision to protect the core at the expense of the surface, the correct decision, the one that keeps the essential functions running while the peripheral ones are sacrificed. The decision that saves lives by costing tissue. His right hand exposed where the mitten had been lost somewhere between Dunmore's house and Ridgeback Hill was the color and approximate temperature of the clay floor beneath Vera's feet. Dunmore looked at her. There was nothing readable in his face as any specific emotion. The categories he used to organize the world, competence, credibility, the reliable hierarchy of credential and gender and established position, had stopped being useful sometime in the past several hours, and his face showed the specific blankness of a man whose organizing system has failed him completely. He held the child out. Vera took Eli from his arms. She turned back into the room. The 16 people already present rearranged without instruction, a space opened near the stove. Aldridge lifted the water pan to maintain temperature. One of the Harker children shifted to make room. Dunmore came in behind her. He closed the door. He stood near it for a moment, taking in the warmth, the lamp, the organized stillness of a woman who had known this was coming and had built the only structure in 4 kilometers that was currently performing as a structure should. Then he sat against the wall. He did not speak for a long time. Eli's right hand was the immediate problem. Deep frostbite, tissue not yet hardened, which meant the window for intervention had not closed but would not remain open indefinitely. Vera worked the same methodology she had applied to Breck's hands. Gradual warming against body heat, not direct heat. The surface and the deeper tissue brought back at the same rate so that circulation could restore without destroying what it was restoring. She held Eli's hand between both of hers, inside her coat, against her side, and she spoke to the child not because he could hear her, but because the sound of a calm voice was information for the 17 other people in the room. It told them that whatever was happening with the boy was being managed. She said, "He's warming. This takes time. He'll come back through this." She said it without looking up from what her hands were doing. Dunmore heard it. He sat against the wall and looked at his own hands on his knees. He was running a calculation, not the kind that fit into any category his confidence had been built from, because this one had no comparable precedent in his experience. It was a calculation about the cost of certainty. He had been certain about Vera Callum since April. He had been certain in the specific, unrevisable way of a man who has been right about most things for long enough that being right has stopped feeling like a conclusion and started feeling like a condition. The certainty had a cost he had not included in the calculation. The cost was sitting in his arms across the room, unconscious, her hands working at the tissue damage his decision had contributed to producing. At 2 in the morning, Eli opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling of packed clay and timber with the equanimity of a child who has not yet developed the apparatus for finding his situation remarkable. He looked at Vera's face above him. He said nothing. She said, "You're warm. Stay still." He stayed still. The flush of returning circulation in his right hand, painful, which was correct, pain meaning the tissue was alive, began its work. She would monitor it through the remaining hours of the night. By morning, she would be confident that he would keep the hand. He would carry a pale scar along the index and middle finger for the rest of his life, a line slightly lighter than the surrounding skin that his mother would describe as looking like a seam. But the hand would function. The hand would hold things. The hours between 2 in the morning and the first light of January 14th were the hours that accounts written afterward could not adequately organize, because they contained no single event large enough to serve as structure. They were the hours of maintenance, fire, water, warmth, rotation of blankets, monitoring of the 2 children with the deepest frostbite presentations, management of 17 people in a space that continued to hold together because it had been built to hold together. Vera slept for 90 minutes somewhere in that expanse, sitting against the south wall with her coat across her. Her body made the decision without consulting her available will, which was its own information about what the preceding hours had cost. In those hours, things settled into their true shapes. Dunmore sat near Eli through the night without touching him, without speaking, present in the way of a man who has accepted that proximity is the only available offering and has stopped performing around that limitation. Breck, his hands recovered enough for use by midnight, took over stove management from the mayor's wife without being asked. He maintained it with the precision of a builder who understood fire as a system with tolerances the same way he understood framing lumber, not with anxiety, but with the professional attention of someone responsible for whether a system holds. Aldridge, who had been running on the particular fuel of self-recrimination since the moment she turned and counted 4 children instead of 6, put her forehead on her knees near 3 in the morning and produced the sound of someone crying with great determination not to be heard. The Harker child nearest her, a girl of perhaps 10, shifted 2 inches closer without looking up. No acknowledgement was made. None was needed. It was the language of people who have been inside something together and do not require the event to be named. Sheriff Osgood was among the people sheltering in the dugout. He had arrived with the Harker family, which meant his presence had been absorbed to the general arrival rather than noted separately. And he sat through the long hours of the night in a corner of the room where the lamplight did not reach him clearly. He did not speak. He had said less than 24 hours ago that he would not close the county school on the word of a woman who lived in a hole on a hill. The county school's roof had come down in the early hours of the storm. Francis and the boy were somewhere in the white, in conditions he had declared manageable. He sat in Vera Callum's dugout in the dark and held this knowledge and did not speak, which was the only honest response available to him. The storm broke on the morning of January 14th, not with drama, with cessation. The roar that had been continuous for 36 hours simply stopped, the way a held note stops, all at once, leaving a silence so complete it had physical weight. The temperature outside climbed to -12, still dangerous in the open. Survivable, which was a different category entirely. Vera unbarred the door. She pushed against the drift that had formed against the exterior wall. 3 attempts before it gave enough for passage. She stepped out onto the altered landscape of Ridgeback Hill. The contours had been rearranged. Drifts in some places reached the roofline. In others, wind had scoured the clay down to bare red ground. The sky was the hard, indifferent blue of a Montana winter morning after violence, the blue that contains no memory of what produced it. She looked toward Harwick. The town's silhouette was wrong. A town, even a small Montana town, asserts itself vertically against a flat landscape, roof lines, chimneys, the 2-story front of the feed store visible from 4 kilometers on a clear day. What she saw instead was horizontal. Drifts and the flat shapes of ruin, the vertical assertions gone. Dunmore's 2-story clapboard house, visible from Ridgeback Hill on clear days as a point of reference and pride, was not visible. In its place, a drift line, below it wreckage she could not yet see clearly, but could calculate from the physics of what the wind had been doing for 36 hours to a structure with north-facing bay windows and a roof pitched to shed rain rather than shed load. She stood outside for 4 minutes. Then she went back. 17 faces turned to her. She looked at them, Breck with his wrapped hands, Aldridge who had dried out through the night, Petey Marsh awake now eating cornmeal from a tin cup with the focused seriousness of a child who has learned that food is not a given. Dunmore sitting with Eli across his knees, Osgood in his corner, Mayor Greer with the expression of a man trying to locate the version of himself that knows how to be in charge. She said, "Wind is down. We move in groups once the temperature comes up a few degrees. Frostbite cases go last with the most cover." She looked at the remaining food. "We eat first." She began moving people out in the early afternoon when the temperature had reached -7 and the sky held clear. She sent them in groups of 4, capable adults in each group, instructions given once. She held Petey Marsh until the 3rd group because his circulation, while restored, was not yet reliable enough for an extended walk. She held Eli in the final group with Dunmore, not because of Dunmore, but because Eli needed 4 more hours of monitoring before she was confident the frostbite damage had stabilized at the level she believed it had. When the last group left, the dugout was quiet for the first time in 36 hours. Vera stood in the center of the room, the stove burning lower, conserving, the lamp extinguished, the south-facing window providing sufficient light now that the sky was clear. The air smelled of wood smoke and the specific density of 17 people compressed into a small space across a night and a day. She breathed it once. Then she took the survey journal from the shelf, sat in the cottonwood chair, and wrote the date, the interior temperature, the exterior temperature, the number of people sheltered, the duration of the event. Below the numbers, one word: intact. She did not write anything else. The word contained what needed to be said. She had spent 9 months building toward this specific outcome, not toward survival as a general condition, but toward the survival of a structure under the precise conditions that the structure had been designed to survive. The earth had held 42 degrees of separation between the world and the people inside it. The roof had not moved, the walls had not moved. The floor was dry. Outside, the count was being assembled from pieces. 19 dead in Harwick and the surrounding homestead claims. 5 of them children who had left the schoolhouse before Aldridge made her decision. Dunmore's cattle were gone, 240 head frozen in the open pasture he had not moved them from, which represented the primary asset of his operation and the foundation of the position he held in Harwick. His 2-story clapboard house was a partial ruin, the north wall collapsed inward, the roof sagging at an angle that would not survive another snowfall. The schoolhouse roof had come down in the early hours. 11 of Harwick's 31 residential structures had suffered major failure. 4 had collapsed entirely. One structure within 4 kilometers of Harwick was fully intact, one working dwelling with functioning heat, dry floor, sealed walls, adequate water, the one they had called Callum's Folly. Vera closed the journal. She put another piece of wood on the stove. She thought about what Dunmore's face had looked like in the moment she took Eli from his arms, not the calculations she had read in him later, not the long accounting of the night, but the first moment, the immediate moment before any of the subsequent processing had begun. A man who had spent 9 months being certain about what she was and what she was capable of, standing in her doorway, holding a child whose life was contingent on everything she had built. She thought about it once, fully. Then she put it in the place she kept things that had served their purpose. And she began to prepare what she would need to say at the meeting she knew was coming. Outside, the valley was silent. The sky was the hard, clear blue of aftermath. 19 people were gone from it. The arithmetic of that was not satisfying in any of the ways that vindication was supposed to feel. It was simply what the numbers said, stripped of everything except their own weight. The numbers did not care how she felt about them. They only required that she had done the work to arrive at them honestly. She had done the work. The meeting was held in the church on January 18th. 6 days after the storm. The church had lost 2 north-facing window panes and a section of ceiling plaster that had come down in a sheet during the worst hours. And the cold moved through the boarded openings with the patient indifference of cold that has found a gap and intends to use it. People sat in their coats. Children sat on laps. The congregation was smaller than any Sunday service in the 4 years since the building went up, because 19 of the people who would otherwise have filled those pews were in the ground or waiting for the ground to soften enough to receive them. Mayor Greer opened with the names. He read them without editorializing, which was the correct decision, and the only honest one available to him: names, circumstances, the specific weight of each loss on a community of this size. When he finished, the room held its silence the way rooms hold silence, when silence is the only response that does not diminish what has just been named. Cresswell Dunmore stood without being called upon. This was not unusual for Dunmore. Everything else about how he stood was. He did not carry the settled ease of a man addressing his natural audience. He stood with the particular uprightness of someone who has decided to carry something in public that he would have preferred to carry privately, because the private option was no longer available to him, and he understood this clearly enough to stop pretending otherwise. His left cheek was still bandaged where the frostbite had gone deep. His hands, visible at his sides, were wrapped at the knuckle. He did not begin with what he had done wrong. He began with Edmund Callum. He said that in 1882 he had received, through the Territorial Land Office, a copy of a survey report from the Dakota Territory covering the Cannonball River drainage and adjacent homestead land. The report had been authored by a senior engineer of the Army Corps, with substantial input documented in the appendix from a draftsman named Edmund Callum. The appendix addressed construction methodology for permanent structures in high wind, high thermal variance environments. It recommended earth-sheltered construction using dense clay soil as thermal mass, south-facing orientation for primary window placement, integrated livestock shelter connected to the main dwelling. Dunmore had read it. He had filed it. He had not acted on it because a draftsman was not a credentialed engineer. And a recommendation from an appendix authored by a man whose official title was draftsman did not carry in Dunmore's calculation the weight of guidance worth restructuring his understanding of construction around. Edmund Callum had died 2 years after writing that appendix. His widow had arrived in Harwick 5 years after his death and built, on a clay hillside, that every person in this room had considered unsuitable, exactly what the appendix described. She had sheltered 23 people through the worst blizzard in territorial memory. 19 people in Harwick were dead. Dunmore looked at the room as he said this, not at Vera yet, at the room, because he needed the room to understand the sequence before he said the last part of it. The last part was that the 19 people whose names Mayor Greer had just read would have had a different probability of surviving if Dunmore had taken seriously what he had read 6 years ago. He did not claim the deaths as his fault in those words. He said, "I had the information. I chose not to use it because of who it came from. That choice had a cost." He paused. "I didn't pay it." Vera was sitting in the third row on the left side, next to Aldridge. She had looked at Dunmore when he began. When he said Edmund's name, she looked at her hands, folded in her lap, and kept looking at them through the part about the appendix and the part about the cost. Her hands were the same hands they had always been, the outer right palm where the graphite stain had lived for 11 years, the knuckles enlarged from the sod work, the index finger of the left hand with its August scar. Edmund's hands had looked like hers by the end of the Dakota years. She had not thought about that in some time. She thought about it now, briefly, completely, then placed it back where she kept it. Dunmore turned to her. He said, "Mrs. Callum doesn't need my apology. What she needs, and what this town needs, is for us to learn what she knows." He looked back at the room. "I'm selling the cattle that survived the storm, that funds the reconstruction. I'm asking her to direct it." He sat down. The calculation was complete. He had stated its terms publicly, which was the only currency he had left that was worth anything in this room. Whatever came next was outside his control, which was a condition he had not lived in for a long time, and which he accepted now with the stillness of a man who has stopped fighting the arithmetic. Thomas Breck spoke from the back of the room before anyone else could fill the silence. His voice had fully recovered even where his hands had not. He said, "I'll take instruction." He said it the way a builder states a professional intention, without the performance of humility, without the drama of conversion, a simple declaration of what he intended to do next. Several heads turned. Several people nodded. Mayor Greer looked at Vera. She stood. She had not prepared remarks because the remarks that mattered in this room were not the kind that benefited from preparation. They were the kind that required only accuracy. She looked at the boarded windows on the north side, at the plaster damage on the ceiling, at the specific structural decisions that had made this building a problem rather than a refuge during the event it had been built to outlast. She said, "We start with the slope behind the schoolhouse, south-facing grade, clay content that will hold thermal mass through February." She looked at Breck. "I'll need your framing knowledge. The timber work on my place took twice as long without it." She looked at the room. "We build what lasts. Everything else is secondary." She sat down. This was the shape of the vindication Harwick gave Vera Callum. Not ceremony. Not a formal recantation of every unkind thing said about Callum's folly in the preceding 9 months. Breck walked up to her after the meeting ended and asked, without preamble, how she oriented the sod courses for the roof installation. He listened to her answer with the focused attention of a professional receiving accurate technical information from a superior source. The mayor's wife stopped her at the door to say her family would bring food to Ridgeback Hill on Tuesdays. A practical offer, not a gesture, and Vera accepted it as such. Sheriff Osgood passed her in the doorway. He did not stop. He did not speak. His eyes carried the specific flatness of a man in the process of understanding something about himself that he is not yet prepared to say aloud and may never be, which was its own form of reckoning and one that would sit with him longer than a public statement would have, pressing on him in the particular way of unspoken accountings that have no resolution date. She did not need him to speak. The knowledge was sufficient. It would remain sufficient for the rest of the time they shared a town. Spring of 1888 was the most sustained period of work Vera had known since the construction of the dugout itself. Harwick rebuilt, not as restoration of what the storm had taken, but as construction of something different, lower earthward, oriented to the sun rather than to the impression of prosperity. She taught by doing. She arrived at a site. With her tools, she began. She explained what her hands were doing as they did it, which was the method Edmund had used in the field, and which she had found more effective than formal instruction because it produced comprehension rather than compliance. Breck proved what she had assessed him as at the meeting. A man of genuine structural skill, who had been working from an incomplete model, and who, given a complete one, applied it with the precision of someone who understood load and material at the level of intuition. They did not become friends. They became something more functional than friendship, which was collaborators who trusted each other's judgment within their respective domains, without requiring that trust to extend beyond those domains. Eli Dunmore healed. His right hand retained full function. The pale scar along the index and middle finger, the line his mother called a seam, would be visible for the rest of his life, appearing at certain angles in certain light as a slightly different texture against the surrounding skin. In late April, on a Saturday morning, when the snow had retreated from the south slope and the first grass was pushing through the red clay, Cresswell Dunmore brought the boy to Ridgeback Hill and stayed at the bottom of the grade while Eli walked up alone. The boy was 6 years old and carried the particular gravity of a child who has been the subject of hushed adult conversations and has absorbed their weight without the context to interpret it. He stopped at the dugout door. He looked at the repaired northeast corner of the roof, which was indistinguishable from the surrounding courses, the roots having knitted through the winter into the seamless membrane she had designed them to become. He looked at Vera. He was holding something with both hands, a young apple sapling, perhaps 30 centimeters tall, the roots wrapped in burlap, which had been tended through at least one previous season by someone who understood what a sapling required before it could be given away. Vera looked at the sapling. She looked at the boy's face, which held the concentration of someone delivering something important and wanting to get the delivery right. She took the sapling with both hands. She said, "I know a spot on the east side that gets morning light." Eli nodded, as though this confirmed something he had been told to believe and now believed. He went back down the hill. Dunmore at the bottom did not look up. He put a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder when the boy reached him, and they walked back toward the valley road without looking back, which was the correct way to complete a transaction that had already said everything it needed to say. Vera planted the sapling that afternoon in a prepared bed on the east slope, in soil amended with the clay-sand mixture she had determined produced the best drainage on that exposure. She did not think about what the tree signified. She thought about what the soil required. These were not incompatible activities, but the second one had a practical immediacy that the first one did not. Summer of 1888 was the summer Harwick became more specifically itself. The new structures were not beautiful, in the way Dunmore's two-story clapboard had been beautiful. They did not assert themselves against the landscape with the vertical confidence of wealth performing its own existence. They were lower, quieter, built into the hillsides where hillsides offered the partnership, built against the earth where the earth's thermal properties could be employed rather than fought. The shape of a community that had learned something at a price that precluded forgetting it. The learning and the price were inseparable. Harwick would not forget because the cost of forgetting had already been paid by people who could not pay it again. Dunmore's ruined north wall he left standing. He built his new house 30 meters to the west, into the hill behind his property, according to Vera's specifications. The standing remnant became, by the following spring, a windbreak for the kitchen garden his sister established on its south side, the bay windows gone with the storm, just wall remaining, just wood. The outline of a decision made before its full cost was included in the calculation. December of 1888 arrived with the specific quiet of a second winter that knows it is being observed. The people of Harwick watched it with the attentiveness of those who have updated their understanding of what the landscape is capable of and intend to maintain that update regardless of how mild the preceding autumn has been. The new structures held through the first cold snap. Breck measured the interior temperatures of three of them and confirmed what Vera's calculations had predicted. Thermal variance of less than 2 degrees through a -15 night without stove fire, which meant the stoves were supplemental rather than essential, which meant the wood consumption was a fraction of what the old clapboard houses had required. He sent her the measurements without comment. She filed them in the survey journal without comment. This was the form their collaboration had taken, and it suited both of them. On the evening of December 19th, Vera sat in the cottonwood chair, the stove burning at its low setting, enough to bring the interior from the Earth's baseline of 12 degrees to 15, no more, the lamp lit. Rue audible in the stable tunnel, a periodic shift of weight on packed clay, the small sounds of an animal warm and fed and unhurried by anything. Outside the temperature was -11. Inside, 15 degrees Celsius. She had no list. This was the first thing she noticed, the absence of the list that had been the organizing architecture of every evening since April 1887. Every evening for 20 months there had been a list. What needed completion before the season changed, before the money ran out, before the structure failed, before the winter arrived and found something she had not addressed. The list was how she had moved from April through September, through January, and out the other side of January. It was the mechanism by which she had converted Edmund's knowledge and her own years of observation into a structure that held 42 degrees of separation between the world and the people inside it. The list was done. Everything on it had been done. The structure held. The people were housed. The method was established in the hands of people who would carry it forward without her needing to stand over them while they did. Breck had 3 apprentices. The knowledge was moving through Harwick by the mechanism that knowledge moves through communities that have paid for it, by practice, by demonstration, by the transmission that occurs when someone watches a thing that works and decides to replicate it, not because they have been told to, but because they have seen what the alternative produces. She looked at her hands in the lamplight. The graphite stain on the outer right palm had faded over the summer. The physical work of hauling and digging and building had replaced the drafting table calluses with different ones, deeper, differently placed. The hands of someone who had stopped drawing structures and started building them. The knuckles were larger than they had been in billing. The August scar on the left index finger caught the light at its particular angle. They were not the hands she had arrived with. They were the hands the work had made of her, which was a different formulation than the hands she had made of herself. And the difference was important because it was honest. She thought about Edmund. She had never confused avoidance with management. So she thought about him directly, the specific angle of his handwriting in the front 40 pages of the survey journal, the way he pressed harder on the downstrokes, which she had been able to identify at a distance before she could read the word. The Dakota winters, the canvas shelter, the specific cold that pressed against the walls, and the specific warmth of earth 2 feet below the frost line, that they had mapped and measured and discussed in the language of people who find the physical world genuinely interesting rather than merely useful. The appendix of the Cannonball River report, which she had helped him write in the last summer, before the ice took him, which had been filed in a territorial land office and read by Cresswell Dunmore and set aside, and which had come back to Harwick 6 years later as a structure that sheltered 23 people through the worst blizzard in territorial memory. She thought, it still holds. Everything he knew still holds. She did not cry. This is not a statement about the management of grief. It is a statement about the distance she had traveled to arrive at this specific evening, in this chair, in this warmth, in the knowledge that the work was done and had been done correctly, and would continue without her having to hold it together by will alone. The distance was its own kind of completion. She had carried Edmund's knowledge from the Dakota Territory through Billings, through two years of solitary preparation, through 9 months of construction, through the blizzard, and out the other side. And she had set it down here in the clay of a Montana hillside, where it would remain after she was gone, in the walls of every structure built according to what he had understood and she had executed, and Harwick had finally, at great cost, learned to value. The stove needed feeding. She fed it. She turned the lamp to its lowest setting. She listened to Rue settle in the stable with one long exhalation, the breath of an animal that has nothing requiring its attention. She closed her eyes. This was not triumph. Triumph was a thing with an audience, a thing that required someone to have lost in order for someone else to have won. This was something quieter and more durable. The first evening in 20 months without a task standing between her and the simple fact of being inside the thing she had built, in the warmth it held, without anything remaining that needed doing before she could rest. The first evening she did not need to survive. She could simply be present in the evidence of what surviving had produced. Outside, December pressed against the hillside with the full weight of a Montana winter. Inside, the earth remembered summer and held it, and gave it back at the rate of dense clay in a well-built structure, slowly, reliably, without drama, exactly as calculated. In the spring of 1891, 3 engineers arrived in Harwick from Helena, sent by the territorial government, in response to a formal recommendation from the Harwick County Land Office. The recommendation had cited reduced fuel costs across the rebuilt settlement, the structural survival rate during the 1888 blizzard, the thermal performance data Vera had been compiling in the survey journal for 3 years and had submitted through the land office registrar without particular expectation of response. The engineers were thorough. 9 days in Harwick, measuring and documenting and interviewing. They spent 6 hours with Vera on the 3rd day. She answered everything, drew diagrams when verbal description was insufficient, explained the sod orientation and its reasoning, walked them through the thermal mass calculation and how clay density affected it, demonstrated the south-facing window geometry and the mathematics of winter sun angle at this latitude. She answered in the language of engineering because that was the language the answers existed in. And she spoke it without apology or performance, because she had been speaking it for 11 years in the field before anyone with a credential had thought to ask. The pamphlet appeared in late 1891. 4 pages, illustrated, distributed to every land office in the territory. The title on the cover read, "The Callum Method, a Guide to Earth-Sheltered Construction for Montana Territory Homesteaders." Callum, her married name. Edmund's name, which had also become hers through 11 years of shared work that the Corps had never formally acknowledged, but which had produced the appendix that Dunmore had read and filed, and which had eventually, through a sequence of events that included 19 deaths and a 6-year-old child's frostbitten hand, and a woman pulling a sled up a clay hillside for 3 weeks, become the official construction methodology of the Montana Territory. Vera bought a copy from the land office in February of 1892. She read it from the first line to the last. The methodology was correct. The diagrams approximated what she would have drawn with more precision, but conveyed what needed conveying. On the final page, in the acknowledgement section, the lead engineer had written, "Methodology developed and executed by V. Callum, Harwick, Montana Territory, 1887. V. Callum." The initial was doing significant work. It could have been Vernon Victor. She looked at it for a moment. Then she folded the pamphlet along its original crease and set it on the shelf beside Edmund's survey journal, where it would remain for the rest of her life, unopened after that first reading, its presence sufficient without requiring anything further from her. In the Territorial Land Office in Harwick, in the filing cabinet, where the 1891 Engineering Survey's original documentation was stored, the lead engineer's working notes contained a line that did not appear in the published pamphlet. The notes read, "Primary source for all methodology, Mrs. Vera Callum, widow of Edmund Callum, draftsman, Army Corps of Engineers. Designed and executed the Ridgeback Hill Earth Sheltered Dwelling, April through September 1887, Harwick, Montana Territory. All practical development of this method belongs to her." The notes were filed correctly. They were not lost. They were in the cabinet, in the folder, in the office, in Harwick, which was still standing, still inhabited, built into the hillsides that faced south, warm through winters that had not become less severe but had become less fatal. Vera lived in the Ridgeback Hill dugout for the remainder of her life. She did not leave Harwick. She did not seek what Harwick had not already given her, which was the specific freedom that follows from having proven the one thing that needed proving and being permitted afterward to simply continue. She taught, not formally, not with credential or schedule. Breck sent his apprentices when questions exceeded his knowledge, which happened regularly enough that Tuesday afternoons on Ridgeback Hill developed their own quiet rhythm. The children who grew up in the new Harwick came to visit the way children visit a place that feels more stable than other places, without requiring that stability to be explained. She gave them coffee when they were old enough. She showed them the survey journal when they asked about the drawings. She did not explain it. She let his handwriting in the first 40 pages carry what it carried, which was sufficient for those who were paying attention. Rue died in April of 1901, on a mild morning not unlike the morning Vera had ridden into Harwick 14 years before. The mare had been moving carefully through the preceding winter, the repaired forelegs stiffening in the cold in a way that required Vera to keep the stable warmer than strictly necessary, which she did without discussion or calculation. Rue had pulled sod bricks up a clay hillside with a fractured leg in a modified harness, and a warmer stable was not a disproportionate return on that. The mare died on the stable floor in the stillness of an animal that has simply stopped rather than struggled. Vera buried her on the east slope beneath the apple tree Eli Dunmore had carried up the hill as a sapling 13 years before, which had grown into a tree of genuine substance. Trunk the diameter of a man's forearm, branches spread wide enough to throw afternoon shade across the gravesite. She dug the grave herself over 2 days, working around a rock layer at 60 centimeters that required patience rather than force. The patience was available. It had always been available. It was the thing the work had required most consistently, and the thing she had most reliably provided. Cresswell Dunmore died in 1909. He had rebuilt his ranching operation on a smaller scale, fewer cattle, managed with more attention to the creek shelter infrastructure his hands had constructed in the winter of 1888. He never spoke to Vera again beyond the practical exchange of information that cohabiting a small territory required. He was not cold. He was not warm. He had made his accounting at the January meeting, stated its terms publicly, funded the reconstruction with the proceeds of his surviving cattle, and proceeded. She had not required more than that. The apple tree was what he had sent her, through his nephew's hands, in April of 1888, and the apple tree was producing fruit every autumn. And that was a more durable transaction than anything additional words would have made of it. The pamphlet was printed a 4th time in 1911. By then, the Callum method had spread into Wyoming and the western Dakotas. It had achieved the particular anonymity of genuinely useful knowledge, absorbed into practice so thoroughly that the origin stops mattering to those using it, the methodology simply becoming the way things are done by people who have learned that it works. In 3 Montana counties, in a stretch of Wyoming along the Powder River, in the southeastern Dakota country where the Cannonball River ran through the clay-heavy soil. Edmund had mapped in 1882, there were structures built into south-facing slopes that held their temperatures through winters that broke barns and took livestock. Inside those structures, in the warmth that the earth held because someone had built correctly, families sat beside small fires and were not cold. And most of them did not know whose knowledge had made that possible, which was the most complete form of transmission, when the knowledge outlives the name attached to it and simply becomes the way the world works for people who have never heard of Vera Callum or Edmund Callum or a gray mare named Rue or a hillside in Harwick, Montana Territory, where a woman once pulled a sled uphill for 3 weeks and rebuilt a failed roof section in 6 days, and sheltered 23 people through the worst blizzard in territorial memory, and sat in December of 1888 in a cottonwood chair in the warmth of something she had built, finally without a list, finally without a task remaining between her and the fact of having done what she came to do. Vera was 84 years old in the autumn of 1929. She had outlasted 2 horses, 3 stoves, 4 printings of the pamphlet, 1 sheriff whose eyes had carried a particular flatness for the remaining 20 years he lived in Harwick, the specific certainty of every person who had looked at Ridgeback Hill and seen a hole rather than a solution, 2 roofing repairs, one in 1903 when the original sod root system had finally exhausted itself and needed replacement with fresh courses, one in 1917 when a wet spring created drainage pressure requiring exterior berm regrading. Both repairs done correctly, both holding afterward as the original had held, because the methodology was sound, and sound methodology does not require revision, only maintenance. She died in November, in the cottonwood chair, in the warmth of the earth she had spent her working life understanding. The lamp was lit. The stove burned at its low setting. The interior temperature was 15 degrees Celsius. She had known what was happening for several weeks, with the same quality of recognition she had applied to weather and soil and structure, the reading of evidence without flinching from its conclusion. She had written a letter to the land office. She had ensured that Breck's eldest apprentice, a young man named Foster, who had her quality of attention to what materials actually do under load, knew where the survey journal was kept and understood what it contained. Foster came first in the morning, as arranged. He stood in the doorway for a moment. In the specific warmth the earth continued to hold, regardless of what had changed inside it. Then he went to the shelf. He took the survey journal in both hands the way you take something you have been entrusted with and intend to carry correctly. On the interior east wall of the dugout, at the height of a person sitting in the cottonwood chair with one arm extended, there were 4 words scratched into the packed clay. The instrument had been Edmund's surveying compass needle, which left a line fine enough to be precise. The scratching was not recent. The clay around the letters had the settled coloration of marks made years ago. In one of the evenings without a list, in the long middle years between the blizzard and the end, Foster crouched to read them. He read them once. He did not need to read them again. The whole town came to the funeral. People from 4 counties. The territorial engineer's office sent a letter. Breck came from the south side of town, where he had built his own earth-sheltered house in 1889, moving slowly at 71 but moving. They buried her on the east slope of Ridgeback Hill, near Rue, near the apple tree, in a grave oriented south, toward the light that arrived at the angle most useful for warming the things that needed warmth. Foster had not been told to orient it this way. He had simply known, from everything he had been taught, about where to face a structure if you wanted it to hold warmth. That south was correct. In the years that followed, people came to the dugout in 1s and 2s to look at the 4 words on the east wall. They came the way people come to a place that has outlasted its own story and become something quieter, not a monument, not a lesson, just the evidence of a specific intelligence applied to a specific problem with enough care that the result was still standing 40 years later. They crouched to read. They traced the letters with their fingers. Some of them had grown up in structures she had taught their parents to build. Some had read the pamphlet without knowing whose hands had produced what the pamphlet described. Some had simply lived in the valley long enough to understand, without needing it stated, what it meant that one structure had held when the others failed, what it had cost the woman who built it, what she had given to a place that had called her work a folly until the day it saved their lives. The 4 words on the wall were, Edmund, it still holds.